After a record-setting season, the High Point University Panthers women's basketball team rose to the top of the Big South, punching their ticket to the NCAA tournament for the first time in program history. Despite this incredible season, very few people know about this story and others like it in women's athletics. Only 3.2% of media coverage is devoted to women's sports, and the men's stories in newspapers outnumbered women's 23-1. Why is this the case? Media rooms like this one are responsible for broadcasting collegiate athletics to the public on various streaming services. However, when it comes to broadcasting women's sports, the broadcasts don't nearly get as much attention as men's.
A lot of women's sports games are broadcasted on sites that you sometimes need to pay to have a subscription for, and that will limit the amount of viewers we get, whereas men's sports will be on actual television or websites that you don't necessarily, or ESPNU or something, whereas ours is on ESPN Plus and you have to pay for that.
The coverage is still not equal, at all. I mean, you have as far as advertising and the games and the commercials about games coming up, I rarely see a WNBA game coming on or anything like that. It's always NBA or NFL. It's never any women's sports. And then the men, they're always playing on ESPN or the mainstream channels, and then the women are on other channels that most people don't have.
Sometimes men's teams get the better times and better days too. So no one's really gonna want to come to a Monday night game when they probably have a test the next day. So maybe Saturday afternoon games where a lot of people have free time. Sunday afternoons are a little hard as well because people are trying to catch up on things.
I also feel further on in the season, there'll probably be more fans just as NCAA tournaments, Big South Championship are coming up. So it's just it is unfortunate that people don't come to earlier games. They only come to the later games, which is understandable, but it's because of the times, I think.
Sometimes it is hard to break out of that traditional model. Because with the newspaper story, if we're covering, with high school games, there's a girls' game first and then a boys' game second. And they're both on the same night, essentially one right after the other. So you kind of have to choose which one you're going to highlight versus one that, is going to be secondary. A lot of times it ends up being the boys' game is kind of the highlight one and the girls' one is second because you just have to choose one.
There's a clear divide in the airtime between men's and women's sports. Much more time is spent talking about male athletes than female athletes, but there have been some significant steps to improve this inequality. Women's sports are trending up, and some events are gaining popularity and more attention from mainstream media, such as the Women's NCAA March Madness Tournament and the Women's World Cup.
I think, especially with the national tournament, I think it made a lot of steps in the right direction, just with the viewership and the clicks on social media and stuff like that. The numbers say it. The women's national championship game, the Sweet 16s, the Final Fours, were all watched almost 20% more than the men in a couple of instances. And people use excuses that the teams that were in the men's weren't as fun to watch or whatever, but I really do think that they were fun games. So I think it circles back around to just being competitive. And I think when you put women's basketball on the big screen, it gives us a voice, number one, to get to show the world what we can do, because a lot of people don't usually get to see it. People use the excuse of not being able to afford to show it on the national television channels, but once again, this year's tournament, I think, just totally throws that excuse out the window.
I think people are starting to finally realize that the female athletes, they are just as competitive as the male athletes. I think their sports are just as fun to watch. And I think just a lot, also I think with social media, people are seeing big highlights on there, so it makes them be oh, I can tune into this and be entertained with it as well.
I guess recognizing female athletes as not just female athletes, just as athletes, period. I feel too often when you talk about men's sports, they're athletes, they're not men athletes. But women's, they're female athletes. But I think altogether we're athletes. We're all equal, really.
I think it's just being talked about more. I think it's on all over social media and things like that, and people see that and then they decide to tune in. And then they realize that when they are watching that it's enjoyable and it's just as fun to watch as any men's basketball game.
As the landscape changes, it is important for students and aspiring broadcasters to realize the problems and effectively address them. Student-run broadcast groups, like SportsLink at High Point University, are working to equalize the coverage of women's and men's events.
It's hard at times with students because they see like the big men's lacrosse, men's basketball, like you hear those names and you think, oh, I want to work those games. And unfortunately at times, like our women's sports don't get as full of a crew. When I was in college, I would always have parents come up to me when I'm running a camera saying, oh, like my grandma's watching, like she loves seeing it. So I'm like, even if it's just one or two people, I know someone's watching these games if it's friends or family. So that's why I try to tell the students that are working with sports, like it's like you have fans from the home team, the away team that want to watch their child, their friend, like whoever, they want to watch them play. So we want to show everyone equally. We want to make sure all our sports are getting covered. And it's like, we have winning teams. You try to sell that to the students and try to sell that to everyone. Like, you want to work these games because they're good and they're going to get good coverage. People are going to tune into these games.
One thing that I've been told that I've kind of taken to heart was to reflect what your community is, whatever that may be. I mean, if your community is excited about whatever sport, if it's football at the moment, you better be out there covering football. So it's not really my place exactly to, force that on somebody if they're not interested in it. I mean, that, like I said before, that would be foolish to devote our resources to that. But if people are excited about it, I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it makes perfect sense from a reporter standpoint. It makes perfect sense from a business standpoint to put your time and effort into covering stuff like that.
As the situation becomes easier to tackle, athletes and journalists are working to make a difference for the future.
Everybody that plays in college was like usually like the star on their team or something, and like they just had it coming to them. So like when you get to college levels and like when you get to the real world for a job or something, like it's going to take a lot more work than you think that you sign yourself up for. So like being prepared for like the hard work and like getting through the hard things, it will like get easier in the end and more enjoyable. Like especially like going from your freshman year to like your junior year, all the upperclassmen try to bring all the underclassmen like in and like help them out as much as they can because they know it's harder. So I think something like going into like the workforce, that's like something to really think about, that it's going to get better in the end, and like you just need to work really hard in the beginning.
I think I just want to continue to be a voice for it. It's something that we're all getting the opportunity to do, just like all the major men's teams do. We're getting our school paid for, and we're playing a sport that we enjoy and love. But I mean, I think I just want to use it to continue to have a voice and be a voice, whether it's for sports, women's sports, or if it's different social justice issues, things like that. Like, I just want to be able to have a voice and help other people feel like they have a voice.
The future looks bright for women, especially as their collegiate and international sports are growing in popularity. As more sports networks and news outlets cover women's sports, interest in them will grow, and eventually women's athletics will become a staple in mainstream media. There's nowhere to go but up.